Good morning and welcome to this Key Stage 3 Thought for the Day on Friday the 12th of June. I hope you're pleased to be coming to the end of your week of assessments and that you feel they've gone well. I always say at this time there is as much to learn afterwards about what you can do to improve next time, so please do make every effort next week to listen to the advice from your teachers as they go through the answers. While I was out on my bike this week, I turned a corner near Bradfield and found the road was littered with the contents of 2 McDonald's takeaway bags. They'd clearly been thrown out of a car window by someone thoughtless enough to think what they were doing didn't matter. Whilst I'm not a fan of McDonald's food, and the sort of person who would throw their rubbish into the countryside is not likely to care where they bought their junk food from, it was an example of how a very small action, insignificant in the eyes of the person carrying it out, can make a big difference. It is just over 2 weeks since the events in Minneapolis when George Floyd was killed by a police officer, and most of the news media time has been spent reflecting on the determination for change around the world to bring about greater equality, which can only be a good thing. It was just one person who was unknown to any other than his family and friends. Just one person dying at a time when in the last 5 months over 400,000 lives have been lost to a new virus. It's another example of how relatively small things can make a big difference. This is not to say that any life is less important than any other, but in particular, George Floyd's death has brought into the public consciousness the wider acknowledgement that accepting things which we know are wrong should not happen. The McDonald's litter is clearly a much less significant example, but small things can have a big impact. It has brought the name of Martin Luther King Jr. back into the spotlight. I'm sure many of you have heard his name, and if you've been to the USA, the chances are you've travelled down a Martin Luther King Boulevard as they appear in almost every city. You may not appreciate what he did or stood for, but you've almost certainly heard these words.
I have a dream that one day, down in Alabama with its vicious racists, with its governor having his lips dripping with the words of interposition and nullification, one day right there in Alabama, little black boys and black girls will be able to join hands with little white boys and white girls as sisters and brothers. I have a dream today.
Until this week, I don't remember listening to the full I Had a Dream speech before, but this week I did, and I would encourage you to look it up on YouTube. Martin Luther King Jr. stood for peaceful protest, and his actions were without doubt what led to huge changes to inequality in the USA. But it was another much less well-known speech he made which I want to share with you today, and I hope you will watch it through. It's just 5 minutes long, and I'll return at the end to say a few more words.
While sitting there autographing books, a demented black woman came up. The only question I heard from her was, "You, Martin Luther King?" And I was looking down writing and I said, "Yes." The next minute I felt something beating on my chest. Before I knew it, I had been stabbed by this demented woman. I was rushed to Harlem Hospital. It was a dark Saturday afternoon. That blade had gone through, and the x-rays revealed that the tip of the blade was on the edge of my aorta, the main artery. And once that's punctured, you're drowned in your own blood. That's the end of you. It came out in the New York Times the next morning that if I had merely sneezed, I would have died. Well, about 4 days later, they allowed me, after the operation, after my chest had been opened and the blade had been taken out, to move around in the wheelchair in the hospital. they allowed me to read some of the mail that came in, and from all over the states and the world, kind letters came in. I read a few, but one of them I will never forget. I had received one from the president and the vice president. I've forgotten what those telegrams said. I'd received a visit and a letter from the governor of New York, but I've forgotten what that letter said. But there was another letter that came from a little girl, a young girl, who was a student at the White Plains High School. And I looked at that letter, and I'll never forget it. It said simply, "Dear Dr. King, I am a 9th grade student at the White Plains High School." She said, "While it should not matter, I would like to mention that I'm a white girl. I read in the paper of your misfortune and of your suffering. And I read that if you had sneezed, you would have died. I'm simply writing you to say that I'm so happy that you didn't sneeze. I want to say tonight that I too am happy that I didn't sneeze, because if I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1960, when students all over the South started sitting in at lunch counters. And I knew that as they were sitting in, they were really standing up for the best in the American dream, and taking the whole nation back to those great wells of democracy which were dug deep by the founding fathers in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been around here in 1962. The Negroes in Albany, Georgia, decided to straighten their backs up. And whenever men and women straighten their backs up, they are going somewhere, because a man can't ride your back unless it is bent. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have been here in 1963. Black people of Birmingham, Alabama, aroused the conscience of this nation and brought into being the Civil Rights Bill. If I had sneezed, I wouldn't have had a chance later that year in August to try to tell America about a dream that I had had. If I had sneezed, I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord.
Martin Luther King Jr. highlighted that it was not a message from the US president that was important to him, but the words written by a 9-year-old white girl. Small things can have a big impact. When Martin Luther King was killed the day after his speech, Robert Kennedy, a US senator and brother of JFK, the president who'd been killed 5 years earlier, took the risky step of going into an entirely African-American ghetto to announce the passing of Martin Luther King. He was advised this could endanger his life and not to do it, but he was determined to show his continued support for civil rights. There was no rioting in Indianapolis that night, although that was not true in other cities around the US. His words acted to calm part of a country in mourning. Small things can have a big impact. The current US president could do much to learn from the actions of true leaders in their time. I'd like to finish this assembly by quoting some of the words from Robert Kennedy's speech that night. He said the following: "What we need is not division. What we need is not hatred. What we need is not violence and lawlessness, but is love and wisdom and compassion toward one another, and a feeling of justice toward those who still suffer, whether they be white or whether they be black. We will have difficult times. We've had difficult times in the past, and we will have difficult times in the future. It's not an end of violence. It's not an end of lawlessness, and it's not the end of disorder. But the vast majority of white people and the vast majority of black people in this country want to live together, want to improve the quality of our life, and want justice for all human beings that abide in our land. In the weeks and months and years ahead, remember, small things you do can make a big difference. I hope you have a great weekend.